The air was damp and heavy out here, headlights slicing through the mist and the darkness pressing close.
Late night on a lonely Appalachian road. The air was damp and heavy. A sense of being watched began to creep in.
I was driving home later than usual that night, later than anyone should really be on these winding Appalachian roads. The hills were thick around me, pressing in on the headlights like dark hands, and the air smelled of wet earth and rot. I'd been working late at the diner, cleaning up dishes long after the last car had gone, and my mind was tired, half expecting the familiar quiet of the drive home to soothe me. That was before the feeling started, the one you get when the air seems heavier, when your skin prickles like a warning you don't want to acknowledge. At first I told myself it was nothing, just fatigue, but then the movement caught my eye. Out of the corner of the rearview mirror, I saw a shadow. It was distant at first, standing at the edge of a bend in the road, dark against the dim outline of trees. But it didn't stay put. It moved when I moved. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, tried to convince myself it was a trick of the headlights, the way the trees cast long, odd shapes after a storm. I sped up and it kept pace, always at the edge of the mirrors, just enough to make me question my sanity. I thought about stopping, pulling over, calling someone, but I was deep in the hollows where cell service vanished like mist. My pulse began to thrum against my chest, loud enough to hear over the engine, over the wind curling through the open windows. Curves came faster than I expected, the tires gripping the wet asphalt. I slowed, thinking maybe I could lose it if I took a tighter turn. But each turn revealed the same dark figure, still there, waiting, patient. Not running, not rushing, just there, keeping a distance that made my chest tighten. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, and I found myself speaking aloud, asking it to leave, begging myself to stop imagining it. Nothing responded except the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. When I finally saw the familiar shapes of my own property through the trees, I thought maybe I was safe, that I'd outrun it. I pulled up the driveway, the tires crunching over gravel, and stopped in front of the house. My chest heaving, I expected the sensation of relief to flood me as I shut off the car, but it didn't. I froze when I saw it, the silhouette still at the edge of the yard, just standing there unmoving, watching. The distance had shrunk, and now the figure seemed closer than the trees should have allowed. I slammed the car door and rushed inside, bolting the door behind me, flipping every light in the living room. Every shadow now seemed suspect, even the ordinary corners that used to feel safe. I checked the windows, peering through the blinds, half expecting it to have vanished, but it didn't. It lingered, just beyond the porch light's reach, patient. I tried to laugh it off, tried to tell myself it was a neighbor or some drifter, but nothing made sense. And then I realized my front door was locked, my dog asleep on the rug, and yet the sense of being watched didn't leave me. I lay in bed that night with the lights on, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind through the trees, made my heart leap. I told myself I was imagining things, that the mind plays tricks when you're alone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't imagination. There was intelligence in those movements, a patience I couldn't explain. I felt it, like cold fingers brushing along the edges of my consciousness, keeping me alert, reminding me I wasn't alone. Days passed, and the feeling didn't go away. I started noticing small things, footprints along the driveway that didn't match my shoes, slight depressions in the grass where nothing should have stepped, a dark smudge along the fence that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I checked the security cameras I'd set up after the first night, and though the footage didn't show much, the shadows were different. The nights were different. I felt its presence without seeing it, just a quiet, oppressive weight that seemed to follow me from room to room. Even when I left the house briefly to fetch supplies or check on a neighbor, I started sleeping with the bedroom door open, lights spilling into the hallway, praying the glow would keep it at bay. But the cold never left, and the sense of being followed intensified the moment I turned my back. At night, I would wake to the sound of footsteps outside my windows, deliberate, slow, almost waiting for me to notice. Sometimes I would see a figure in the reflection of the glass, tall, thin, shrouded in shadow, just beyond the reach of the porch lights. It didn't move away when I looked directly. It stayed, watching. I tried everything. I drove the roads during the day, checked the hollows and the patches of forest surrounding my home, looking for any sign, any clue. But the woods were silent, nothing unusual beyond the ordinary deer and the whisper of wind through the pines. I asked neighbors if anyone had seen strange figures along the roads at night. Most shrugged, some laughed, but one old man in town gave me a long look and simply said, "Some things follow, boy, and they don't always leave." That line stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I began to notice patterns. Whenever I slowed, the presence drew nearer. Whenever I looked away for a moment, it crept closer. I documented everything, trying to rationalize, but the evidence was inconclusive. The footprints weren't human. The depressions in the grass didn't match any tire or paw I could identify. And each night it found its way to the yard, sometimes close enough that the porch light would cast its outline faintly against the trees. Always waiting, always patient, never aggressive, but the dread it inspired was unbearable. One evening I tried confronting it directly. I went out onto the porch, flashlight in hand, calling its presence. The woods were silent, the air heavy. Then I saw it step from the shadow, just a silhouette, no features, and stand at the edge of the yard. I shouted, demanding it leave, and it tilted its head like it understood, like it had been listening all along. I expected fear to make it run, but it didn't. It didn't move at all, and in that stillness, I felt more afraid than ever. The silence around it was absolute, oppressive, like the night itself had concentrated into that figure. I tried sleeping that night, but the house felt wrong. Every corner seemed to hold a memory of its gaze. Every shadow stretched longer than it should. I lay awake, listening to the creak of the floorboards, wondering if it had entered, if it was closer now, if it had learned the rhythms of my life. The dread was constant, like a weight on my chest, pressing into my ribs. I considered leaving, driving far away, but the thought of being followed along every road in these hills, of it tracking me no matter where I went, kept me rooted in terror. It wasn't until a few days later that the final proof of its reality revealed itself. I went to the backyard to bring in firewood and found footprints around the house. Numerous prints that didn't match mine, didn't match the dog's. They circled the house, leading nowhere, always returning to the same spots near the porch, as if marking territory, reminding me that it had been here all along. My stomach dropped. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't fatigue. Something had been following me, watching me, knowing me, and it hadn't left. Since then, every drive feels heavy, every night unbearable. I still see shadows in the corners of my vision, and sometimes, when I glance in the rearview mirror, I swear I can see it lingering there, just behind me, patient and waiting. I keep the doors locked, lights on, but the feeling never truly leaves. It doesn't need to act, it doesn't need to approach. Its presence alone is enough to unmoor me from comfort, to make me question the safety of my own home. The hills that once felt familiar now feel like traps, their curves hiding something that watches and waits. Even now, months later, I can't drive past that stretch of road without my hands tightening on the wheel, without my eyes scanning every shadow for movement that doesn't belong. It's a quiet terror, patient, unrelenting, and I know, deep down, it will never leave. I've lived on the edge of this hollow for most of my life, tucked between two ridgelines where the forest swallows the last bit of daylight long before the sun's gone. Folks around here call it a dead valley. The sound just stops once evening hits. No crickets, no wind through the trees, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just silence so thick it presses on your eardrums. I used to find comfort in that quiet. It meant home. But now, every time it falls, I feel that same silence watching me back. It started small, just disturbances in the gravel driveway, odd, almost purposeful trails near my trash cans, pressed so deep you could see where something had knelt. I blamed raccoons at first, or the stray dogs that wander these woods. But the tracks were too narrow for a paw, too long for any animal I knew. I told myself I was imagining it. You have to, when you live this far out. If you start believing every strange sound or shadow is something more, you'll lose your mind before winter. A few nights later, I was out back after dark, dragging the trash bins to the road. That's when I first heard it. The wind carried whispers, not words, but something that felt like them. The kind of noise that fades the second you stop to listen. My cat Daisy followed me halfway down the porch but froze, fur bristling, eyes fixed on the tree line. I called to her, but she wouldn't move, wouldn't even blink. Then she turned and bolted inside so fast her claws scraped the wood. I laughed it off, told myself she'd seen a possum. But when I turned back, the woods were still. Too still. The quiet out here can play tricks, but that night it felt like the trees were holding their breath. The next morning I found fresh trails again, this time closer to the porch. They were faint, pressed into the frost-dusted ground, 2 sets side by side, leading straight to my back steps and stopping there. I checked for prints, for tire marks, anything human, but it was just long impressions, like something dragging its feet, deliberate but unhurried. I swept them away with the broom, trying to convince myself it was runoff from rain or an animal's passing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Over the next week, things began to change in small ways. The air felt heavier, like it was filled with static. Daisy stopped going outside altogether, sleeping under the bed most days, eyes fixed on the door as if waiting for something to come through it. The whispers returned at night, faint but constant. Sometimes I'd wake to them, half dreaming, certain I could hear a low voice beneath the sound of the wind, just enough to make my blood run cold. I started leaving the porch light on, but even that didn't help. The light seemed to stop halfway across the yard, like the darkness itself was thicker there. It wasn't long before I began seeing things, shapes that shouldn't be there. At first, it was just glimpses, a darker patch of dark between the trees, something tall and still. I'd blink and it would be gone, but then it started staying longer. One night I saw it clearly, tall, thin, standing at the tree line. It didn't move, didn't sway like the branches. It just stood there. I told myself it was a tree I hadn't noticed before, a trick of the moonlight. But when I went out the next morning, there was nothing there. No tree, no broken branch, just the impression of something that had been standing in that exact spot for hours. After that, I couldn't sit still in my own home. Every creak of the floorboards made me tense. I started keeping a flashlight by the door, leaving the radio on at night for noise. But the quiet outside swallowed even that. Some nights, I'd step onto the porch just to prove to myself I wasn't crazy. I'd stand there, flashlight trembling in my hand, shining it toward the woods. And always, without fail, there was nothing. Just the black line of trees, the faint hiss of wind over the ridge. Until I turned off the light, then I'd feel it. That weight, that presence, like someone standing a few feet away, watching, waiting for me to step into the dark. One night, I'd had enough. I decided to walk to my neighbor's place about half a mile down the hollow. The walk should have taken 10 minutes. I told myself I needed company to clear my head. But as soon as I stepped onto the road, the silence deepened, and the woods felt alive in a way that made my stomach turn. I could feel something pacing me just out of sight. Soft footfalls in the leaves, always a few yards behind. When I stopped, it stopped. When I started again, it followed. I tried shining my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam just bounced off the fog, showing me nothing but empty woods. By the time I reached my neighbor's house, I was shaking so bad I could barely knock. He didn't answer. The windows were dark. I stood there a long time, listening, heart hammering. Then I heard it again, those soft, dragging steps on the gravel coming up behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. Every instinct told me not to look, not to acknowledge it. Instead, I ran. The kind of run where your body moves before your mind does, where breath tears from your throat. I didn't stop until I was back at my porch, chest heaving, flashlight beam shaking across the yard. Nothing was there, but the quiet felt thicker than ever. That night I sat inside with every light on, holding the flashlight like a weapon. Around midnight, the power went out. Not a flicker or a surge, just gone. The kind of blackout where even the hum of the refrigerator dies. I waited for the generator to kick in, but it didn't. The silence pressed against the windows like a living thing. And then I heard the sound, slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the gravel. Not on the road this time. In my yard. They circled the house once, the crunch of each step careful, almost thoughtful. I held my breath, listening as they stopped beneath the kitchen window. For a long moment, nothing. Then I heard a low creak like someone resting their weight against the siding. I wanted to move, to run, but fear pinned me in place. The steps resumed, moving toward the porch. The boards groaned one by one under invisible weight. Then came a sound that made my blood turn to ice, the soft rattle of the doorknob. It didn't turn, didn't force. It just tested, A slow rattle, a pause, another, like it was learning how the lock worked. I sat there in the dark, barely breathing, the flashlight trembling in my hand, waiting for the next sound. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Finally, the boards creaked again, footsteps retreating. But they didn't go far. The last sound I heard that night was the faint scrape of something dragging along the porch rail, slow and deliberate. Morning came, and with it, false comfort. The lights came back on by themselves, no sign of outage anywhere else. I went outside to look for tracks, and sure enough, there they were, fresh impressions in the frost, circling the porch. Long, thin, almost human, but not quite. I followed them to the tree line, where they vanished into the leaves. For days after, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself it had ended. I even tried sitting out on the porch again, sipping coffee, watching the mist roll through the hollow. But I could feel it. The quiet had changed. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was listening. The forest no longer felt indifferent. It felt aware, like something in those trees had learned me, my voice, my habits, my hours. Now, every evening, right as the light drains from the sky, I feel it return. The whispers start first, faint as breath. Then the air thickens, the silence deepens, and the world beyond my yard blurs. I never see it directly anymore. I think it learned that much, but I feel it. Always just out of sight, just past the edge of the porch light, waiting. I don't tell people about it anymore. They wouldn't believe me. You can't describe a presence that isn't quite there, can't prove a silence that feels like a living thing. But I know it's still out there, patient and watching, learning the rhythm of my life. And sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason, I swear I can hear it breathing on the other side of the wall, quiet, measured, like it's waiting for me to fall back asleep. I never gave much thought to the stories about old houses, at least not seriously. They were always the kind of tales passed down over a drink at the general store, or whispered by neighbors after a long day of work. Half warnings, half entertainment. So when I inherited my uncle's cabin, a modest, weathered structure tucked into a ridge outside a small holler, I thought little of it. The cabin had been in the family for generations, a relic of another time, and while it was rough around the edges, it had character. I was excited to have a place of my own, isolated but not so far from town that I'd feel trapped. The first night, the cabin was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I had just come from a road trip, dragging a few boxes in, and I expected the stillness of the hills to be comforting. But something felt off. The air had a weight to it, a damp chill that seeped into the wooden floors and creaking walls. I chalked it up to the cabin's age, the way old timber groans under its own weight, and settled in for the night. That's when I first heard it. The attic stairs. At first I thought it was the house settling. I told myself the wind had picked up, rattling the boards. But the steps were too deliberate, too measured. They weren't the light patter of a squirrel or the scurrying of mice. They were heavy, slow, careful, as if someone was choosing each step. I froze, listening. Each footfall paused, just long enough to make me catch my breath, and then continued again. There was a rhythm to it, a patience that made my stomach knot. I tried ignoring it, hoping the noise would fade, but it didn't. Night after night, the same pattern repeated. Sometimes it started early, just after sunset, and sometimes it began around midnight. I walked the floors, checked the attic door, inspected the ceiling for leaks or drafts, but found nothing. The smell was another thing that caught me off guard, a faint, earthy scent, damp soil mixed with mildew lingering in the air above me. It was subtle at first, but the longer I stayed, the stronger it became, like the house itself had exhaled something unnatural. I remember the night I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I climbed the stairs to confront whatever it was. My flashlight beam cut through the dust motes, illuminating the worn wooden boards, each step echoing under my weight. I reached the attic door and hesitated, heart hammering in my chest, as though the house itself were holding its breath. I pushed it open slowly. The attic was empty, cold, dark, and silent except for the faint hum of the wind through the shingles. Dust swirled in the beam of the flashlight, and the lingering smell of earth was stronger here. I stepped further in, checking corners, leaning into shadowed nooks. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. and yet the sensation of being observed was overwhelming. I backed down the stairs quickly, convincing myself it had to be my imagination, but the footsteps didn't stop. Even when I slept tucked beneath the attic ceiling, they came. Always slow, deliberate, careful, not aggressive, not loud, patient. They paced above me, moving and pausing in patterns I began to recognize. Eventually, I started leaving doors open, trying to communicate with it, in a way. I'd speak softly, asking it to leave, muttering into the dark spaces it claimed, and sometimes, I swear, the pauses in the steps would shift, slightly longer, almost as if listening. Almost as if it understood me. I began noticing changes elsewhere in the cabin. The air felt thicker, colder in certain corners. Objects would be subtly displaced. A chair nudged a little closer to the stairs. A broom left leaning where I hadn't left it. At first, I thought I'd done it in sleep, exhaustion catching me from my long drive and work. But the feeling of being watched became undeniable. I could sense it standing just beyond my field of vision, aware of my every movement. Days passed and the pattern became part of my life. I woke in the night to the soft creak of stairs, listened to the pauses as I lay rigid in bed, heart racing. The terror wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Its patience, its constancy, was enough. I felt cornered in my own home, unable to escape the rhythm of the steps. Even during the day, the memory of the attic smell, the sound of those boards, followed me through the cabin like a shadow. I tried remedies. I left lights on, installed extra locks, sprinkled salt along the floorboards, said prayers I'd never spoken aloud before. Nothing worked. The presence never attacked, never revealed itself fully, yet its patience was relentless. It was in the air, in the shadows, in the very structure of the house. I began talking to it, explaining my comings and goings, acknowledging its existence silently. The pauses in the steps started to feel almost conversational, a rhythm I could follow, though I never answered back aloud. It was still, in its way, waiting for me to do something wrong, or perhaps waiting to simply exist alongside me. Sleep became an ordeal. I would lie awake, listening for a change in the pacing, counting steps in my head until dawn. The attic door remained slightly ajar, a silent invitation, or perhaps a challenge. Sometimes I would reach a hand toward it as I drifted off, only to pull back at the last second, feeling an intuition I could not name. I stopped asking why. There was no logic here. The house and its unseen occupant didn't care about reason, only about presence, about endurance, about watching and waiting. Over time, I stopped leaving the house during certain hours, afraid. The momentary absence might trigger a different kind of attention. The world outside felt distant, irrelevant. Even the neighbors' lights seemed faint and distant, as though their presence could not reach me here. My life narrowed to the rhythm of the attic stairs, the smell of damp wood, the silent, careful patience that pervaded the space above my head. One night, after a particularly long day, I fell asleep in the living room. The steps began as usual, slow, measured. I could hear the pauses, the faint brushing of air as something moved, yet I dared not open my eyes. For the first time I felt it lingered just at the edge of perception, not advancing, not retreating, simply there. I thought of leaving, packing a bag, and abandoning the cabin entirely, but the inertia of fear pinned me. The unknown outside seemed more frightening than the known terror inside. Eventually, the months blurred together. I stopped trying to confront it directly. I stopped trying to rationalize. The steps above became a background, a haunting constant I lived with. Occasionally, I would glimpse shadows along the attic's threshold in my peripheral vision, or notice the lingering scent of damp earth after it had been quiet for days. My life became defined by its presence, patient and unyielding, a quiet horror embedded in the ordinary. I never figured out what it was, and I don't think I ever will. It never spoke, never revealed its form, never broke the delicate tension between the living and whatever watched from above. The terror of that house wasn't loud or violent. It was patient, intimate, a weight pressing against the walls, the ceiling, and me. I learned to coexist with it in a way, acknowledging the rhythm, feeling its patience, understanding that some things do not need to act to terrify. Even now, when I hear an old house settling, I think of that cabin, of the stairs and the pauses, and I feel that same dread. There's a lesson there, though I can't say I understand it. Some houses keep more than memories, some keep patience, and some keep the watching presence of something that refuses to leave. And I know, every time I step into an old attic or hear creaking boards above me, that it's still there, waiting, patient, and quietly terrifying.